The dust cloud rose so thick on the Arizona road that afternoon in 1879 that Josephine Fletcher thought she might choke on it before the stagecoach even reached Camp Verde. And then the wheel hit a rock and sent her precious camera equipment sliding across the floor toward certain destruction. She lunged forward, catching the leather case just before it could slam into the opposite bench. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she clutched the case to her chest, feeling the weight of Mr. Whitmore's trust pressing down on her shoulders. The photographer had taken a chance hiring a 21-year-old woman as his assistant, and she would not repay that faith by letting his second-best camera get destroyed on her first solo assignment. "Careful there, miss," the elderly woman across from her said, adjusting her bonnet. "Nearly took a tumble yourself." "The equipment is worth more than I am," Josephine replied, then immediately regretted the bitter edge to her words. Her mother would have scolded her for such talk. But then, her mother had been gone for 3 years now, taken by the fever that swept through St. Louis, and left Josephine with nothing but debts and a desperate need to make her own way in the world. The stagecoach lurched again as they descended into the valley, where Camp Verde sprawled along the banks of the Verde River. Josephine peered out the window, taking in the collection of adobe buildings, wooden storefronts, and canvas tents that made up this military town. Fort Verde sat on a rise to the east, its neat rows of buildings a stark contrast to the organized chaos of the civilian settlement below. She had been sent here to document the town's growing prosperity, to capture images of the settlers and soldiers who were carving civilization out of the Arizona wilderness. Mr. Whitmore had secured a commission from a Boston publisher who wanted authentic scenes of Western life, and Josephine was determined to deliver photographs that would make them both proud. The stagecoach jerked to a halt outside the Wells Fargo office, and Josephine carefully gathered her belongings. She had 2 cases of equipment, a carpet bag with her clothes, and Mr. Whitmore's detailed instructions folded in her pocket. Find lodging, set up the portable darkroom, begin photographing by week's end. She had 2 months to complete the assignment. The driver, a grizzled man with tobacco-stained whiskers, handed down her cases with surprising gentleness. "You sure you got someone meeting you, miss? This ain't exactly a town for a lady on her own." "I have the name of a boarding house," Josephine said, consulting the paper in her hand. "Mrs. Chen's establishment on 2nd Street. "Ah, that is a respectable place. Chinese lady runs it clean and proper. You will be safe enough there." He tipped his hat and climbed back up to the driver's box, leaving Josephine standing in the dusty street with her equipment at her feet. She had just bent to pick up the first case when a shadow fell across her. "Those look heavy. Can I help you with them?" Josephine straightened, ready to politely refuse, and found herself looking up at a man who seemed to embody every story she had ever heard about Western cowboys. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and sun-bronzed skin that spoke of days spent under the Arizona sky. His dark hair curled slightly where it touched the collar of his worn shirt, and his eyes were an unexpected shade of green that made her think of the forests back home in Missouri. "I can manage, thank you," she said, though the camera case alone weighed a good 30 pounds. "Did not say you could not," he replied, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. "Just offering to help. Those look like photographers' cases. You are the assistant Mr. Whitmore sent?" Josephine blinked in surprise. "You know Mr. Whitmore. Got his telegram last week." "I am Xavier Jamison, though folks around here call me Zave. I run cattle on the spread north of town, but I have been helping coordinate the arrangements for your stay. The Army wants to make sure they look good in those photographs, and the town council figured somebody ought to make sure you can get around safely." I did not realize I would need an escort." The words came out sharper than she intended, born of too many men assuming she needed help she had not asked for. Xavier's expression did not change, but something in his eyes suggested he understood her irritation. "You do not need one. But Camp Verde is growing fast, and not all the growth is the kind you want to meet in a dark alley. Having someone who knows the territory might make your work easier. No obligations, Miss Fletcher, just practical help if you want it." The way he said her name made her realize he had done more than just receive a telegram. He had made inquiries, learned about her, prepared for her arrival. It should have felt intrusive, but instead, it felt almost protective. And despite her fierce independence, Josephine had to admit that having a local guide might indeed make her assignment easier. "Thank you, Mr. Jamison. I would appreciate help getting my equipment to the boarding house, at least." "Xav," he corrected, bending to pick up both cases as though they weighed nothing. "Anybody who calls me Mr. Jamison is usually about to serve me with a lawsuit or try to sell me something I do not need." Despite herself, Josephine smiled. "Then you may call me Josephine." "Josie suits you better," he said, then started walking before she could protest the nickname. She hurried to keep up with his long strides, her carpet bag bouncing against her leg. "And what makes you think you know what suits me? We met precisely 3 minutes ago." 3.5, Xavier said, glancing back at her with something that might have been a grin. "And I figure anyone who travels alone to Arizona territory to take photographs must not be the formal type. But if I am wrong, I will apologize and stick with Josephine." They turned onto 2nd Street, where the buildings were a mixture of adobe and wood, some freshly painted and others weathered to gray. A few women in calico dresses watched from doorways, and a group of soldiers from the fort passed by, tipping their hats to Josephine. She nodded in return, acutely aware that she was already becoming a curiosity in this small town. Mrs. Chen's boarding house proved to be a neat 2-story adobe building with a covered porch and actual glass windows, a luxury in these parts. A woman who looked to be in her 40s stepped out to greet them, wiping her hands on her apron. Her black hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her dark eyes assessed Josephine with the kind of thorough examination that only another woman could give. "You must be Miss Fletcher," she said, her English carrying only the faintest accent. "I have your room ready. Mr. Jamison, thank you for bringing her safely." "Just doing what is neighborly, Mrs. Chen." Xavier set the cases down on the porch with care. "I will be back tomorrow morning if that is agreeable, Josephine. Thought I might show you around town, introduce you to some folks who might make good subjects for your photographs." "That would be helpful, thank you." Josephine found herself reluctant to see him go, which was absurd. She had just met the man, but there was something steady about him, something that made her feel less alone in this strange new place. Xavier touched the brim of his hat and walked away, his boots raising small puffs of dust with each step. "Mrs. Chen watched him go with an expression Josephine could not quite read, then turned to her new boarder. "Come inside. You must be exhausted from the journey. I have tea ready and there is water for washing. Supper is at 6 o'clock. The room Mrs. Chen led her to was small but immaculately clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, a chest of drawers, and a table by the window that would serve perfectly for checking her equipment. The walls were whitewashed adobe, cool to the touch, and a breeze came through the open window, carrying the scent of the river. "This is perfect," Josephine said sincerely. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. You are welcome here," the older woman replied. "I know what it is to make your own way. If you need anything, you ask, and if any man troubles you, including Mr. Jamison, you tell me immediately." "Has Mr. Jamison been known to trouble women?" Josephine asked, trying to keep her tone light. Mrs. Chen's expression softened. No. Xavier is one of the good ones, which is rare enough out here. But a woman alone must be careful, even with good men, especially with good men sometimes. After Mrs. Chen left, Josephine opened her cases and carefully examined each piece of equipment. The camera had survived the journey intact, as had the glass plates, chemicals, and developing trays. She spent the next hour organizing everything, taking comfort in the familiar ritual. Photography had saved her after her mother's death, giving her a purpose and a means of supporting herself. Mr. Whitmore had recognized her talent and her determination, and she would not let him down. That night, she lay in bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of Camp Verde. Somewhere, a piano played a cheerful tune. Dogs barked in the distance. A horse whinnied, and men's voices rose and fell in conversation she could not quite make out. It was so different from St. Louis, from the life she had known. But as she drifted off to sleep, she found herself thinking not of home but of tomorrow, and of a green-eyed cowboy who had called her Josie as though they had known each other for years. Xavier arrived at precisely 8 o'clock the next morning, riding a handsome bay gelding and leading a gentle-looking mare. Josephine had been ready since 7, having laid out her working dress, a practical gray cotton that would not show dust, and her most comfortable boots. She had also packed a smaller carrying case with the camera and a dozen glass plates, enough to begin her work. "Morning," Xavier called as she stepped onto the porch. "Figured we could ride rather than walk. Cover more ground that way and you can get a feel for the area." "I have not ridden in some time," Josephine admitted. "We did not keep horses in St. Louis. Daisy here is gentle as they come. She will take care of you." Xavier dismounted and came to hold the mare's bridle. "Do you need help mounting? I can manage." Josephine tied her case to the saddle, then arranged her skirts and swung up into the saddle with only a slight wobble. She had ridden as a girl, before her father's business failed and they had to sell everything, and the skills came back quickly enough. They rode through Camp Verde at an easy pace, with Xavier pointing out landmarks and introducing her to the people they passed. The blacksmith, a massive man named Tom who looked like he could bend horseshoes with his bare hands. The general store owner, Mrs. Patterson, who carried everything from fabric to firearms. The town doctor, a young man named Samuel who had come west for his health and stayed because the territory needed him. "How long have you been here?" Josephine asked as they rode past the adobe church at the north end of town. 5 years this August. Came out from Texas with a herd of cattle and a notion that I could make something of myself. Bought land cheap, worked hard, got lucky a few times. Now I have got a decent spread and enough cattle to keep me busy. Xavier sat easy in his saddle, completely at home in this landscape of red rock and green river valley. "You have family here?" "No family anywhere, really. My parents died when I was 15, cholera. I worked on ranches in Texas until I had enough saved to strike out on my own." He said it matter-of-factly without self-pity, but Josephine heard the echo of her own loss in his words. "I am sorry. I lost my mother 3 years ago. My father passed when I was 12. Seems we have that in common then." Xavier looked at her with understanding in those green eyes. "Makes you grow up fast, does it not? Having to figure everything out on your own." "It does." Josephine found herself wanting to tell him more, to share the story of how she had found work in Mr. Whitmore's studio, how photography had become both her livelihood and her passion. But before she could continue, they crested a small rise, and she caught her breath at the view. The Verde Valley spread before them, a patchwork of green fields and red earth, with the river winding through it like a silver ribbon. To the east, the Mogollon Rim rose in layers of sedimentary rock, its cliffs glowing golden in the morning sun. To the west, the Black Hills formed a darker boundary, their slopes covered with juniper and pine. "This is beautiful," Josephine breathed. "I need to photograph this." "Not now, the light is wrong, but perhaps at sunset, when the shadows are longer. I can bring you back whenever you like." Xavier's voice held a note of pleasure, as though her appreciation of his adopted home pleased him. "There are dozens of spots around here that would make fine photographs. The Indian ruins up in the cliffs, the waterfalls in Wet Beaver Creek, the old Spanish mission south of town. Those all sound wonderful, but Mr. Whitmore's commission is specifically for images of town life. The settlers, the soldiers, the businesses. He wants to show people back east what the new Arizona Territory is really like. Then we should head to the fort. Colonel Henderson said he would make time for you this morning, and his troops will be drilling at 10. Might make for an interesting photograph." Fort Verde proved to be more impressive than Josephine had expected. The compound consisted of several long adobe buildings arranged around a central parade ground, with officers' quarters, barracks, a hospital, and various support structures all neat and orderly. Soldiers in their blue uniforms moved with purpose, and the whole place had an air of disciplined efficiency. Colonel Henderson was a stern-faced man in his 50s, with gray hair and the bearing of someone who had spent his entire adult life in the military. He received them in his office, which was surprisingly comfortable with its wooden furniture and detailed maps covering the walls. "Miss Fletcher, welcome to Fort Verde. I understand you are here to document our operations for a Boston publisher." "Yes, sir. I hope to capture images that show the important work the Army is doing in protecting the settlers and maintaining peace in the territory." The colonel nodded approvingly. "We are proud of what we have accomplished here. When I arrived in 1873, this whole valley was a battleground. The Apache wars were at their height, and settlers could not travel safely. Now we have peaceful relations with most of the tribes, and the valley is prospering." Josephine knew the history was more complicated than that the peaceful relations had come at a terrible cost to the Apache people who had been forced onto reservations. But she simply nodded and asked permission to photograph the morning drill. The soldiers assembled on the parade ground with precision, their movements synchronized as they marched and turned on command. Josephine set up her camera, adjusting the tripod until the frame captured both the neat rows of men and the dramatic backdrop of the Mogollon Rim. She had brought prepared plates, but the exposure would still take several seconds, so she waited until the troops were at attention, motionless, before removing the lens cap. Xavier stood nearby, watching her work with evident interest. "How long do they have to hold still?" "About 10 seconds in this light. Movement will blur the image." She counted silently, then replaced the lens cap and carefully removed the exposed plate. "I will need to develop this fairly soon. The chemistry is time-sensitive. I will take you back to the boarding house after this, Mrs. Chen said she cleared out a storage room for you to use as a darkroom." Over the next week, Josephine fell into a rhythm. Each morning, Xavier would arrive with the horses, and they would spend several hours visiting different locations around Camp Verde. She photographed the general store, the blacksmith shop, the church on Sunday morning. She captured images of families in their Sunday best, of cowboys bringing cattle to market, of the Apache scouts who worked with the Army, their faces solemn and dignified in front of her camera. And through it all, Xavier was there. Patient when she needed to wait for the right light, helpful in carrying her equipment, skilled at putting her subjects at ease with a joke or a kind word. He seemed to know everyone in the valley, and his presence opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed to a young woman from back east. But it was more than just his helpfulness that drew Josephine to him. It was the way he listened when she talked about her work, genuinely interested in the technical aspects of photography. It was the stories he told about his ranch, about the cattle drives and the hard work of building something lasting in this wild country. It was the comfortable silences that fell between them as they rode, as though they had known each other far longer than a week. On the 8th day of her stay in Camp Verde, Xavier invited her to visit his ranch. It is about 5 miles north of town. Nothing fancy, but I would like you to see it. And I thought you might want to photograph some genuine ranch operations for your collection. They set out early in the morning, before the heat of the day set in. The ride took them through open grassland dotted with grazing cattle, their red and brown hides sleek in the sunshine. Xavier pointed out the boundaries of his property, the water sources that made it valuable, the line shack where he sometimes stayed during roundups. "This is all yours?" Josephine asked, impressed by the scope of it. "Every acre paid for, fair and square." Started with 640 acres 5 years ago, bought another half section 2 years back when old man Harris decided to move back to Kansas. "It is not the biggest spread in the territory, but it is mine." The pride in his voice was unmistakable, and Josephine understood it completely. It was the same pride she felt when one of her photographs turned out particularly well, the satisfaction of creating something through your own effort and skill. Xavier's ranch house was a low adobe building with a covered porch, simple but well maintained. A barn and several corrals stood nearby, and a windmill turned lazily, pumping water into a large trough. Everything spoke of hard work and careful planning. Inside, the house was surprisingly comfortable. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace at one end and a sturdy table in the center. 2 doors led to what Josephine assumed were bedrooms. The walls were whitewashed, and the floor was hard packed earth covered with woven rugs. A few books sat on a shelf, and she recognized titles she had read herself, dime novels mostly, but also a volume of poetry and a well-worn Bible. "Coffee?" Xavier asked, moving to the stove where a pot sat warming. "Please." Josephine set down her equipment case and walked to the window, which looked out over the valley. "You can see for miles from here. That is one reason I chose this spot. Wanted to be able to see trouble coming, though thankfully there has not been much of that." Xavier poured 2 cups of coffee and handed her one. "Sugar, just black, thank you." She took a sip, found it strong and bitter but not unpleasant. "Do you live here alone?" "I've got 2 hands who help with the cattle, Miguel and his son Carlos. They have got a place down by the creek. During roundup, I hire on a few more men, but mostly it is just the 3 of us." He leaned against the wall, studying her with those green eyes. "It can get lonely sometimes." The admission hung in the air between them, weighted with meanings Josephine was not quite ready to examine. She set down her coffee cup and busied herself with her camera. "Where would you like me to photograph? The barn, perhaps, or you working with the cattle?" I was thinking something different. Xavier's voice had changed, become almost hesitant. "I was hoping you might photograph me here at the house. Maybe sitting on the porch. Something I could send to my cousin in Texas. Let him see that I have made good out here. Of course." Josephine was touched by the request, by the vulnerability it revealed. For all his confidence and capability, Xavier wanted proof of his success, something concrete to show the family he still had. "Let me set up outside. The morning light should be perfect." She positioned him on the porch steps, with the house and the valley visible behind him. He had put on a clean shirt for the occasion, she noticed, and brushed his hair back from his face. He looked uncomfortable at first, too aware of the camera, but she talked to him while she prepared the plate. asking about his cousin, about his life in Texas before he came to Arizona. "Hold still now," she said, and removed the lens cap through the ground glass. She saw him as the camera saw him. A strong man in his prime, weathered by sun and work but unbowed by it. There was determination in the set of his jaw, hope in his eyes as he looked toward some distant point she could not see. She knew, even before she developed the plate, that this would be one of her finest photographs. "All done," she said, replacing the lens cap. "I will develop it tonight and show you the print tomorrow. I appreciate it." Xavier stood, stretching. "Now, how about I show you some actual ranch work? I have got to check on the cattle in the north pasture, and there is a trail through there that offers some spectacular views." They spent the rest of the morning riding through Xavier's land, and Josephine took several photographs of cattle grazing, of Xavier roping a calf that had gotten tangled in brush, of the vast open landscape that seemed to stretch on forever. But her favorite moments were the ones in between, when they simply rode side by side, talking about everything and nothing. Xavier told her about learning to rope as a boy, about his first cattle drive, about the time he had gotten lost in a dust storm and thought he would never find his way home. She told him about discovering photography, about the magic of watching an image appear in the developing solution, about the freedom she had found in this work that let her travel and see the world on her own terms. "You are brave," Xavier said at one point. "Coming out here alone, doing work most men would not attempt. That takes courage." "Or foolishness," Josephine replied, though his words warmed something inside her chest. "Sometimes I think they are the same thing. Maybe they are, but I would rather be foolishly brave than sensibly cowardly." They stopped for lunch by a creek, where cottonwood trees provided shade and the water ran clear and cold over smooth stones. Xavier had brought bread, cheese, and apples in his saddlebags, and they ate sitting on a fallen log, watching dragonflies skim across the water's surface. "Can I ask you something?" Xavier said after a while. "Of course." "Why did you really come out here? I mean, I know about the commission from Mr. Whitmore, but you could have said no. This is not easy country for anyone, let alone a woman on her own. What made you say yes?" Josephine considered the question, trying to find words for feelings she had not fully examined herself. "I suppose I wanted to prove something. To Mr. Whitmore that he was right to trust me. To myself that I could do this. And maybe to show that women can do more than society expects of us. That we can travel, can work, can be independent. You do not want to marry, have a family." The question could have been intrusive, but Xavier asked it gently, with genuine curiosity rather than judgment. Josephine found herself answering honestly. "I do not know. I always thought I would when I was younger. But then my father died and we lost everything, and I saw how vulnerable that made my mother. She had no way to support herself, no skills the world valued. When she got sick, I could not even afford a decent doctor. I swore then that I would never be that helpless, that I would always be able to take care of myself." She paused, picking at the bread in her hands. "But I suppose that does not mean I can never marry. Just that I would need to marry someone who understood that I would always want to keep working, keep being myself." "That does not seem like too much to ask," Xavier said quietly. They rode back to Camp Verde in the late afternoon, and Josephine spent the evening in her makeshift darkroom, developing the day's photographs. The image of Xavier on his porch steps turned out even better than she had hoped. She made 2 prints, one for his cousin and one she told herself was for her portfolio, but that she knew in her heart she wanted simply to keep. The next morning, Xavier had business in town that would keep him occupied, so Josephine decided to work on her own. She took her camera to the main street and photographed the storefronts, the wagons bringing supplies from Prescott, the mix of people who made Camp Verde their home. Cowboys and soldiers, merchants and miners, Mexican families and Chinese laborers, all building lives in this frontier town. She was setting up for a photograph of the church when a man approached her, stumbling slightly. He was youngish, perhaps 30, with the red nose and bleary eyes of someone who drank too much. His clothes were dirty, and he smelled of whiskey even from several feet away. "Well, hello there, pretty lady," he said, his words slurred. "You are that photographer girl everyone's talking about. How about you take my picture?" "I would be happy to, sir, but perhaps when you are feeling more yourself." Josephine kept her voice polite but firm, not wanting to provoke him. "Feeling more myself? I am just fine right now." He took a step closer and Josephine instinctively moved back. "Come on, do not be unfriendly, just one little photograph. I am sorry, but I really must decline." Josephine began to pack up her camera, her heart beating faster. The street was not deserted, but the people nearby seemed content to mind their own business, and she suddenly felt very alone and very far from help. The drunk man reached out and grabbed her arm. "I am being nice, asking polite. The least you could do is be nice back. Let go of me." Josephine tried to pull away, but his grip was surprisingly strong. "Not until you agree to take my picture. Or maybe we could go get a drink instead, you and me. I will buy you something nice." "The lady asked you to let go." Xavier's voice came from behind Josephine, cold and hard in a way she had never heard before. The drunk man looked up, his face going pale as he saw who had spoken. "Xav, I did not mean nothing, just being friendly. Release her. Now." Xavier had not raised his voice, but there was steel in it that made even Josephine shiver. The man dropped her arm as though it had burned him and stumbled backward. Sorry, I was just talking to her. That is all. Go sleep it off, Parker. And if I hear about you bothering Miss Fletcher or any other lady in this town, you and I will have a serious problem." Parker muttered something that might have been an apology and hurried away, nearly tripping over his own feet in his haste. Xavier waited until he was out of sight, then turned to Josephine, his expression softening. "Are you all right? Did he hurt you?" "I am fine, just startled." Josephine was annoyed to find her hands trembling as she tried to fold the camera's tripod. "I can handle myself, you know. I have dealt with drunks before. I know you can." Xavier gently took the tripod from her and folded it with practiced ease. "But that does not mean you should have to. Parker is usually harmless, but he gets mean when he drinks. I am sorry you had to deal with that. It is not your fault." Josephine took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. "Thank you for intervening. I was starting to worry he would not take no for an answer. He would have regretted it if he had pushed further. Mrs. Chen would have skinned him alive, and then Doc Samuel probably would have practiced his surgical skills on what was left." Xavier's attempt at humor helped ease the tension. "Come on, let me buy you lunch at the hotel restaurant. You look like you could use something to eat." Over stew and fresh bread, Josephine found herself relaxing again. Xavier kept the conversation light, telling her amusing stories about his cattle, about the time a bull had chased him up a tree and he had been stuck there for 3 hours until Miguel came looking for him. "You must think I am very brave for a man who gets treed by his own livestock," Xavier said with a self-deprecating grin. "I think you are smart enough to know when to retreat," Josephine replied. "That is not cowardice, that is survival." Xavier's expression grew serious. "Josie, I want you to know that if you ever feel unsafe, day or night, you can send for me. Mrs. Chen knows where to find me, and I can be in town in less than an hour if I am at the ranch. That is kind of you, but I cannot expect you to be my personal guardian. You have your own work to do." "I know I do not have to, I want to." Xavier reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the touch warm and solid and reassuring. "I care about what happens to you, Josie." The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken feelings. Josephine looked down at their joined hands, at the contrast between his sun-darkened skin and her paler fingers, and felt something shift inside her chest. This was more than gratitude, more than friendship. This was the beginning of something she had convinced herself she did not want, did not need. But as she looked up and met Xavier's green eyes, she realized she had been lying to herself. She did want this, want him, want the connection that was building between them with each passing day. It terrified her, this feeling of falling, of losing control. But it also exhilarated her in a way nothing else ever had. "I care about you too," she said softly. Xavier's smile was like the sun coming out from behind clouds, bright and warming. "Then we have got something worth exploring, you and I." After that day, their relationship changed in subtle but unmistakable ways. Xavier still came each morning to escort her around the territory, still helped carry her equipment and introduce her to potential subjects. But now there were lingering glances, accidental touches that felt anything but accidental, conversations that went deeper than mere friendship. Josephine learned that Xavier had a younger sister who had died of scarlet fever when she was only 8, that he blamed himself for not getting the doctor quickly enough. He learned that Josephine's mother had once been a talented pianist, that music had filled their home before poverty silenced it. They shared their losses and their dreams, their fears and their hopes, building an intimacy that went far beyond anything Josephine had experienced before. 3 weeks into her stay in Camp Verde, Xavier took her to see the ancient cliff dwellings in the hills east of town. The Apache called them the Old Ones' houses, remnants of a civilization that had vanished long before the Spanish arrived. Stone rooms built into alcoves in the cliff face, their walls still standing after centuries, decorated with pictographs that told stories Josephine could only guess at. "This is incredible," she breathed, setting up her camera to capture the ruins against the red rock cliff. Mr. Whitmore said to focus on current life, but surely he would not object to a few photographs of these. "Nobody knows who built them or where they went," Xavier said, examining a pictograph of what looked like a hunter pursuing a deer. "Makes you think about all the people who have lived in this valley, all the lives that came and went. We are just the latest, I suppose. Do you ever worry that what you are building will disappear too, that in 100 years no one will remember Xavier Jamison and his ranch?" "Sometimes." Xavier turned to look at her, his expression thoughtful. "But then I figure that is not really the point. The point is that I am here now doing the best I can, building something that matters while I am alive. If it lasts, that is good. If it does not, well, at least I tried." That is a healthy way to look at it. Josephine prepared a glass plate and slid it into the camera. "Hold still for a moment. I want you in this photograph, gives it scale." She positioned him near the cliff dwelling's entrance, his tall form dwarfed by the ancient stonework. Through the ground glass, she saw him standing between past and present, a man building his future on land haunted by forgotten history. The image moved her in a way she could not quite articulate. After she had finished photographing the ruins, they climbed higher, to a ledge that overlooked the entire valley. Camp Verde was visible in the distance, a tiny cluster of buildings beside the green thread of the river. The Mogollon Rim rose to the north, and mountains marked the horizon in every direction. "This is my favorite spot," Xavier said, sitting on a rock outcropping with his legs dangling over the edge. "I come here when I need to think, when the ranch gets to be too much, or when I just need to remember how big the world is." Josephine sat beside him, careful of her skirts. It is beautiful. Everything here is beautiful. I never expected to love Arizona so much, but I find myself not wanting to leave. How much longer do you have on your assignment? 5 more weeks. Mr. Whitmore expects me back in St. Louis by mid-September to help with the fall portrait season. The thought of leaving, which had seemed distant and abstract, suddenly felt painfully real. I have enough photographs for the commission already, but I want to make sure I have the best possible images before I go. What happens after that? Will you stay in St. Louis, or does Mr. Whitmore send you on other assignments? I do not know. He has mentioned possibly sending me to photograph mining operations in Colorado next year, but nothing is certain. Josephine plucked at a loose thread on her skirt. Why do you ask? Xavier was quiet for a moment, his gaze on the distant horizon. I suppose I am wondering if there is any chance you might decide to stay in Camp Verde, not for an assignment but because you want to. Josephine's heart began to beat faster. Xavier, are you asking what I think you are asking? I am asking if you might consider building a life here, with me. Xavier turned to face her, and the vulnerability in his expression took her breath away. I know it is soon. We have only known each other 3 weeks, but I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you, Josie. You are smart and brave and talented, and you make me laugh, and when I am with you, everything feels right in a way it has not since I was a kid and my family was still alive. Tears pricked at Josephine's eyes. I feel the same way, but Xavier, I cannot give up my work. Photography is not just something I do, it is who I am. I would never ask you to give it up. Xavier took her hands in his grip warm and steady. There are people in Arizona who need photographs too. Families wanting portraits, businesses needing documentation, maybe even a newspaper that would pay for images. And if Mr. Whitmore has assignments that take you away sometimes, well, I can live with that as long as I know you are coming back to me. You would really be willing to marry a woman who travels for work, who might be gone for weeks at a time? Josie, I would marry you if you said you wanted to photograph the moon and needed to live in a hot air balloon to do it. I do not want to change you. I want to build a life with you, exactly as you are. Josephine found herself laughing through her tears. That is possibly the most ridiculous and wonderful thing anyone has ever said to me. Is that a yes? She looked at him, at this man who had appeared in her life such a short time ago but who already felt essential to her happiness. She thought about the life she had built in St. Louis, the independence she had fought so hard for, the promises she had made to herself. And then she thought about waking up every morning in that adobe house overlooking the valley, about coming home from her travels to Xavier's arms, about building something together that was stronger than what either of them could create alone. Yes, she said. Yes, I will marry you. Xavier's whoop of joy echoed off the canyon walls, and then he was kissing her, his lips warm and soft and tasting of the dust and sun that permeated everything in this wild country. Josephine kissed him back, pouring into it all the hope and fear and love that churned inside her, and felt him respond with equal passion. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. You have made me the happiest man in the Arizona Territory. When did you know? Josephine asked. That you wanted to marry me, honestly. That first day when you told me you could manage your own equipment but then let me help anyway. You were proud but not stubborn about it, strong but not afraid to accept help when it made sense. And those eyes of yours, Josie. A man could get lost in them and count himself lucky for it. I knew that first day too, Josephine admitted. Or at least, I knew you were dangerous. You made me feel things I had convinced myself I did not want to feel. Dangerous, am I? Xavier grinned. Wait until you see me try to dance at our wedding. That is when you will truly understand danger. They talked for hours on that ledge, making plans and dreaming out loud. They would marry as soon as Josephine completed her assignment, a simple ceremony in the Camp Verde church. She would write to Mr. Whitmore, thanking him for the opportunity, but explaining that she would be staying in Arizona. She would establish herself as a photographer in the territory, perhaps opening a small studio in town while still taking commissions that interested her. Xavier would expand the ranch, building a larger house where they could raise a family if they were blessed with children. He would teach her to rope and ride better, and she would teach him about photography. They would work side by side, two independent people who chose to be together because they made each other better. As the sun began to set, painting the valley in shades of gold and crimson, they rode back to Camp Verde in companionable silence. Josephine's mind was already racing ahead, thinking about all the arrangements that would need to be made, the letters she would have to write, the life she would be leaving behind in St. Louis. But none of it frightened her the way it might have a month ago. With Xavier beside her, she felt capable of anything. They stopped at the boarding house and Xavier dismounted to help her down from Daisy. He held her a moment longer than necessary, his hands on her waist, his eyes searching her face. No regrets yet, none at all, Josephine assured him. Though you might want to ask me again after you see me develop photographs at 2 in the morning, because the light was perfect for exactly 5 minutes at sunset, and I had to take advantage of it. I will build you a proper darkroom, Xavier promised. One where you can develop photographs at any hour without waking the whole house. Mrs. Chen was waiting on the porch, and her knowing smile suggested she had guessed something of what had transpired. Mr. Jamison, would you like to stay for supper? I made extra. That is kind of you, Mrs. Chen, but I should get back to the ranch. Miguel will be wondering what happened to me. Xavier tipped his hat to her, then turned back to Josephine. I will see you tomorrow, Josephine confirmed and watched him ride away into the gathering dusk. Mrs. Chen ushered her inside and poured them both tea. So, he asked you and you said yes. How did you know? I have seen the way he looks at you, like you hung the moon and stars, and you look at him the same way when you think no one is watching. Mrs. Chen's smile was gentle. I am happy for you both. Xavier is a good man and you are a strong woman. That is a good foundation for a marriage. Were you married, Mrs. Chen, if you do not mind me asking? I was. My husband came to California for the gold rush and I followed him from China. We worked hard, saved our money, bought a restaurant in San Francisco. Then the sickness came and he died, and I could not stay in that city anymore. Too many memories. Mrs. Chen's voice was matter-of-fact, but Josephine heard the old grief beneath it. I came here 5 years ago, started this boarding house. It is a good life, but I miss him still. I am sorry for your loss. Life gives us what it gives us. We can curse it or accept it. I choose acceptance. Mrs. Chen refilled their cups. But I am glad you will have what I had, even if only for a while. Love is worth the risk of loss. That night, Josephine lay in bed thinking about Mrs. Chen's words. Love was indeed a risk, a leap into the unknown that could end in joy or heartbreak. But as she thought about Xavier, about the life they would build together, she felt a peace settle over her that she had not known since before her father died. She was done running from connection, from vulnerability, from the possibility of love. She was ready to risk everything for the chance at happiness. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Josephine continued her photography work, determined to complete her commission to the best of her ability. But now she also made time to learn more about Xavier's world, visiting the ranch regularly, meeting his hands Miguel and Carlos, even trying her hand at roping under Xavier's patient instruction. You are thinking too hard, Xavier said, as her loop missed the fence post for the 5th time. Roping is about feel, not thought. Let your body remember what your mind is trying to force. That is easy for you to say. You have been doing this since you were a child. But Josephine tried again, letting her arm move more naturally, and this time the loop settled neatly over the post. "There you go," Xavier whooped. "By our 1st anniversary, I will have you roping cattle like you were born to it." She also began planning their wedding with help from Mrs. Chen and several other women in town who had taken her under their wing. It would be a small affair, just the townspeople who had become friends during her stay, but it would be meaningful. Josephine wrote to Mr. Whitmore, explaining her decision to remain in Arizona and expressing her gratitude for all he had taught her. She also wrote to the few friends she had made in St. Louis, knowing some would understand her choice and others would think her mad for marrying a cowboy and staying in the wild frontier. "Let them think what they like," Xavier said, when she expressed worry about what people back east would say. "You are not living your life for them. You are living it for yourself and for us." 6 weeks after Josephine's arrival in Camp Verde, on a bright Saturday morning in September of 1879, she married Xavier Jamison in the small adobe church at the north end of town. She wore a simple dress of cream-colored cotton that Mrs. Chen had helped her sew, with blue ribbons at the waist and cuffs. Xavier wore his best suit, slightly worn but brushed and pressed, and he looked at her as though she were the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Reverend Thomas performed the ceremony, his voice carrying easily in the small space. The church was full of people, not just the settlers and soldiers Josephine had photographed, but also some of Xavier's fellow ranchers, Mrs. Chen and her friends from the Chinese community, even a few Apache scouts from the fort who had become friendly with Xavier over the years. "Do you, Xavier Jamison, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" "I do." Xavier's voice was steady, his green eyes locked on Josephine's face. "And do you, Josephine Fletcher, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" "I do." Josephine felt tears threatening but blinked them back. This was a beginning, not an ending, and she would not mar it with sadness. "Then, by the power vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Xavier, you may kiss your bride." Xavier cupped her face in his hands and kissed her gently, sweetly, a promise of all the kisses to come. The church erupted in applause and cheers, and Josephine felt herself smiling so hard her cheeks hurt. They held a reception in the yard behind the church, with tables laden with food that the townswomen had prepared. There was roast beef and baked beans, cornbread and apple pie, and even a small wedding cake that Mrs. Patterson had somehow managed to create despite the limitations of her wood-burning stove. Xavier insisted on dancing with his new wife, and though he had warned her about his lack of skill, he managed to lead her through a creditable waltz while a fiddler played. "See, I am not entirely hopeless," Xavier murmured in her ear. "You are perfect," Josephine replied, and meant it. As the sun began to set, they said their goodbyes and rode together to the ranch that would now be Josephine's home. Xavier had spent the past week preparing for her arrival, cleaning and organizing, even installing shelves in the spare room that would become her darkroom. Miguel and Carlos had moved some of their gear out of the barn to make room for Josephine's photography equipment, and someone, probably Mrs. Chen, had left fresh flowers in a jar on the kitchen table. Xavier lifted Josephine down from Daisy and carried her over the threshold, making her laugh. I am perfectly capable of walking, you know. I know. But I have been looking forward to doing this since you said yes. Xavier set her down carefully, then turned to light the oil lamps. Welcome home, Josie. Home. The word settled into Josephine's chest, warm and right. This was home now, this simple adobe house overlooking the Verde Valley, this place she had never heard of 3 months ago. Home was Xavier's arms around her, his lips on hers, the promise of a future they would build together. That night, they lay in bed with the windows open, listening to the sounds of the Arizona night. Coyotes yipped in the distance, and an owl called from somewhere nearby. Xavier held Josephine close, one hand stroking her hair, the other resting on her waist. "Happy?" he asked. "Happier than I knew I could be," Josephine answered honestly. "I thought independence was the most important thing, that I could not be truly myself if I was attached to someone else. But with you, I feel more myself than ever. You make me braver, Xavier. You make me believe I can do anything." "That is funny because you do the same for me. Before you came, I was content with the ranch, with building something solid, but you made me want more. Made me want to build a life full of adventure and love and all the messy, wonderful things I was too scared to hope for." Xavier kissed the top of her head. "We are going to be happy together, Josie. I am going to make sure of it." "We will make sure of it together," Josephine corrected. "That is how marriage works, or so I am told." They fell asleep tangled together, and Josephine dreamed of photographs yet to be taken, of moments yet to be captured, of a life spreading before her like the Arizona landscape, vast and beautiful and full of possibility. The early weeks of marriage were an adjustment. Josephine had to learn the rhythms of ranch life, the early mornings and the physically demanding work. Xavier had to learn to share his space, to accommodate another person's needs and schedules. But they approached these challenges with humor and patience, determined to make their unusual partnership work. Josephine set up her darkroom and began taking portrait commissions from families in Camp Verde and the surrounding ranches. Word spread that there was a skilled photographer in the area, and soon she had more work than she could handle. She documented births and weddings, anniversaries and funerals, all the moments people wanted to preserve. She also continued her artistic work, capturing the Arizona landscape in different seasons and lights, building a portfolio that would eventually be displayed in galleries back east. Xavier expanded his cattle operation, buying more land and hiring additional hands. The work was hard and sometimes dangerous, but he loved it with a passion that Josephine understood because it mirrored her own love of photography. They supported each other's dreams, celebrated each other's successes, and comforted each other through failures and setbacks. In the spring of 1880, Josephine discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with a complicated mix of joy and terror. She wanted a child, wanted to give Xavier the family he had lost so young. But she also worried about how motherhood would affect her work, whether she would be able to continue photographing once a baby demanded her attention. "We will figure it out," Xavier assured her, his hand resting gently on her still flat stomach. "Plenty of women work and raise children. It will not always be easy, but we will make it work." And they did. When their son was born in December of that year, a healthy boy they named Thomas after Josephine's father, they rearranged their lives to accommodate him. Mrs. Chen recommended a young Mexican woman named Rosa, who had recently lost her own child to illness and was grateful to serve as a nurse. With Rosa's help, Josephine could continue her photography work while knowing Thomas was well cared for. Xavier proved to be a devoted father, often carrying Thomas in a sling while he worked around the ranch, talking to the baby about cattle and horses and the land that would one day be his. Watching them together, Josephine felt her heart expand in ways she had not known possible. "He has your eyes," she said one evening as Xavier rocked Thomas to sleep. "But your stubborn chin," Xavier replied with a grin. "This boy is going to be a handful." 2 years later, they had a daughter they named Clara, for Josephine's mother. Clara came into the world screaming her displeasure and did not stop for what felt like months. But she had Xavier's green eyes and Josephine's dark hair, and they loved her with a fierceness that sometimes frightened them both. The years passed in a rhythm of work and family, of challenges met and overcome. The ranch prospered, and Josephine's reputation as a photographer spread throughout the territory. She was commissioned to photograph the territorial governor when he visited Camp Verde, and several of her landscape images were purchased by a gallery in San Francisco. In 1885, when Thomas was 5 and Clara was 3, a drought struck the Verde Valley. For months, almost no rain fell, and the grass turned brown and brittle. Xavier's cattle grew thin, and several ranchers went bankrupt, forced to sell their land for pennies on the dollar. It was the hardest time they had faced as a couple, and there were nights when Josephine could see the worry eating at Xavier, could feel the weight of possible failure pressing down on both of them. "We will get through this," she told him, lying awake beside him in the darkness. "We have faced hard things before. Not like this. If we lose the ranch, Josie, I do not know what we will do. This is all I know, all I have ever been good at. Then we will not lose it. We will find a way." And they did, scraping together every penny, selling off some of their land to buy feed for the remaining cattle, taking odd jobs in town to supplement their income. Josephine took on more portrait work, sometimes traveling to other towns for commissions that paid well. Xavier hired himself out for cattle drives, leaving for weeks at a time to earn extra money. It was hard and it was frightening, but it also brought them closer together. They learned that they could weather any storm as long as they had each other, that their love was strong enough to survive even the worst circumstances. When the rains finally came in the fall of 1886, they stood on their porch watching the water pour from the sky, holding each other and crying with relief. "We made it," Xavier said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "We made it through." "We did," Josephine agreed, "and we are stronger for it." The ranch recovered slowly, but it did recover. By 1888, they were back to full strength, with cattle filling the pastures and money in the bank. Thomas had grown into a serious boy who loved helping his father with the animals, and Clara was a whirlwind of energy and curiosity, who drove Rosa to distraction with her endless questions. In the spring of 1889, Josephine received a letter from Mr. Whitmore's daughter. The old photographer had passed away peacefully in his sleep, and in his will, he had left Josephine all of his equipment and his studio in St. Louis. The letter explained that Mr. Whitmore had often spoken of his talented assistant, who had chosen love and adventure over security, and he wanted her to have the tools to continue creating art. Josephine wept when she read the letter, mourning the man who had given her a chance when no one else would, who had taught her not just the technical skills of photography but the artistry as well. Xavier held her while she cried, understanding without words what Mr. Whitmore's faith in her had meant. "You should go back to St. Louis," Xavier said after she had calmed. "See the studio arranged to have the equipment shipped here. It is what he would have wanted." So Josephine made the journey back east for the first time in 10 years, bringing Clara with her because the girl was old enough to travel, and because Josephine wanted her daughter to see the wider world. They stayed in St. Louis for 3 weeks, and Josephine showed Clara the neighborhoods where she had grown up, the church where her parents were buried, the studio where she had learned her craft. Mr. Whitmore's studio was exactly as she remembered it, filled with cameras and backdrops and all the paraphernalia of the photographer's trade. His daughter, a kind woman in her 40s, insisted Josephine take everything, helped her pack it all carefully for shipment to Arizona. "Father talked about you often," the daughter said. "He said you were the best assistant he ever had, that you saw light the way poets see words. He would be so proud of what you have accomplished." "He was a wonderful teacher," Josephine replied, her throat tight with emotion. "I would not be who I am without him." On the train back to Arizona, with Clara asleep in her lap, Josephine thought about the path her life had taken. If someone had told her 10 years ago that she would marry a cowboy and live on a ranch in Arizona territory, she would have thought them insane. But here she was, and she could not imagine any other life. She had her work, her family, her home. She had Xavier, who loved her completely and supported her dreams. She had children who were healthy and happy. What more could anyone ask for? They arrived back in Camp Verde on a warm May evening to find Xavier and Thomas waiting at the station. Thomas had grown in the 3 weeks they had been gone, or so it seemed to Josephine, and he hung back shyly until Clara ran to him and started chattering about all the things she had seen in St. Louis. Xavier swept Josephine into his arms, holding her close. "I missed you so much. The house felt empty without you. I missed you too, but I am home now and I am not going anywhere again for a long time." Josephine kissed him, not caring who saw, grateful beyond words to be back in his arms. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own joys and sorrows. In 1892, they had another son, a surprise baby they named Daniel. He was a sweet-natured child who loved nothing better than following Josephine around as she worked, watching in fascination as she prepared her plates and developed her photographs. "That one is going to be an artist," Xavier predicted when Daniel was 4 and had begun drawing everything he saw. "He has got your eye for beauty, Josie." Thomas grew into a capable young man who took over more and more of the ranch work, giving Xavier time to pursue other interests. He became involved in territorial politics, fighting for statehood and fair treatment for all of Arizona's diverse residents. Josephine was proud of him, of the way he used his influence to help others rather than just enrich himself. Clara surprised everyone by announcing at 16 that she wanted to study medicine, to become a doctor like the nurses who had cared for her when she was sick with pneumonia as a child. It was an audacious dream for a woman in 1897, but Josephine and Xavier encouraged her, helping her find a medical school in San Francisco that accepted female students. "She is so much like you," Xavier said as they watched Clara board the stage that would take her to the train station, beginning her journey to California. "Determined to do what she wants, no matter what anyone thinks." "She is like both of us," Josephine corrected. "She has your courage and your stubbornness too." Daniel continued to develop his artistic talents, and when he was 12, Josephine began teaching him photography. He took to it naturally, with an instinct for composition that amazed her. Together, they documented the changing face of the Arizona territory as it moved toward statehood, capturing images of the old ways disappearing and new ones taking their place. In 1899, Xavier turned 45, and Josephine organized a surprise party for him at the ranch. Everyone they had met over the past 20 years seemed to be there, spilling out of the house and onto the porch and into the yard. Mrs. Chen, now in her 70s, sat in a place of honor, cackling with laughter at something Miguel had said. Thomas had brought his new wife, a sensible woman named Sarah who was already expecting their first child. Clara had come home from medical school for the occasion, full of stories about her studies. Josephine stood on the porch watching the celebration, feeling a profound sense of contentment. They had built something lasting here, something that would continue long after they were gone. Not just the ranch, but a family, a community, a legacy of love and hard work and determination. Xavier found her there, slipping an arm around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" "About that first day you met me at the stagecoach," Josephine said. "About how scared I was, and how determined to prove I could do everything on my own. And then you came along and showed me that I did not have to do everything alone, that accepting help and love did not make me weak." "You were never weak. You were the strongest person I had ever met." Xavier kissed her temple. "Still are, even if you do let me carry your camera equipment sometimes. Only because you complain so much if I do not," Josephine teased. "That first photograph I took of you, sitting on the porch at the ranch, I knew even then that I wanted to keep you. I told myself it was for my portfolio, but really I just wanted to have you with me always. You do have me, always." Xavier turned her to face him, his green eyes still as bright as they had been that first day. "Every moment with you has been worth capturing, Josie. You are in my forever." Tears pricked at Josephine's eyes. "That is the most beautiful thing you have ever said to me." "Well, I have been practicing for 20 years. Figured I ought to get it right eventually." Xavier smiled, then kissed her properly, the kind of kiss that still made her heart race after all these years. The party continued around them, full of laughter and music and the comfortable chaos of family and friends. Thomas proposed a toast to his parents, his voice carrying across the yard. "To Xavier and Josephine, who taught all of us what it means to build a life worth living. May we all be as fortunate in love as they have been." Everyone raised their glasses, and Josephine felt Xavier's arm tighten around her. This was her life, the one she had chosen and built and fought for. She had captured so many moments over the years, preserving them in silver and glass for future generations to see. But the moments that mattered most were not the ones frozen in photographs. They were the ones lived fully. The touch of Xavier's hand, the sound of her children's laughter, the warmth of the Arizona sun on her face. As the celebration wound down and the guests began to leave, Josephine and Xavier sat together on the porch steps, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. It was the same view they had shared for 20 years, but it never got old, never became ordinary. Every night was different, every moment new. "You ever regret it?" Xavier asked. "Staying here instead of pursuing photography in the big cities? You could have been famous, had your work in museums and galleries." "Some of my work is in galleries," Josephine pointed out. "But no, I have never regretted it. Fame is not what I wanted, Xavier. I wanted a life that mattered, work that fulfilled me, love that sustained me. And I got all of that right here with you. I am glad, because I could not have done any of this without you. You made me believe in more than just surviving, more than just building a ranch. You made me believe in building a life." Xavier stood and pulled her to her feet. "Come on, let us go inside. I want to show you something." He led her to the room that served as both their bedroom and, on occasion, her office. On the dresser sat a leather-bound album she had never seen before. Xavier handed it to her, watching her face carefully. "Open it." Inside were photographs, dozens of them, images she had taken over the years. Xavier on horseback, silhouetted against the setting sun. Thomas as a baby, sleeping in his father's arms. Clara laughing as she chased chickens across the yard. Daniel covered in paint, grinning at the camera. Family gatherings, cattle roundups, quiet moments captured and preserved. But what made Josephine catch her breath was that someone, Xavier she realized, had written captions beneath each photograph. Not just dates and locations, but memories, feelings, the stories behind the images. The day Josie agreed to marry me, and I thought I might burst from happiness. Thomas's first steps, taken while I was supposed to be watching him. Clara's 8th birthday, when she told us she wanted to be a doctor and we knew she would do it. Xavier, this is beautiful, Josephine whispered, turning the pages with trembling hands. How long have you been working on this? A few years. Figured someone should document the documentarian, preserve the memories of the person who preserves everyone else's memories. Xavier sat beside her, looking at the photographs. You have spent 20 years capturing moments for other people, Josie. I wanted to make sure your moments got captured too. Josephine could not speak for the emotion clogging her throat. She simply leaned against Xavier, letting him hold her while she paged through the album, reliving their life together one image at a time. The years rolled on, bringing both joy and sorrow as years always do. In 1901, Mrs. Chen passed away peacefully in her sleep, and Josephine mourned the woman who had been both friend and mentor. In 1903, Thomas and Sarah welcomed their 3rd child, a boy they named Xavier after his grandfather. Clara graduated from medical school in 1905 and opened a practice in Phoenix, becoming one of the first female doctors in the new state of Arizona, which had finally achieved statehood in 1912. Daniel married a girl from Camp Verde and took over the photography business, expanding it to include a proper studio in town while Josephine gradually reduced her workload. She found she did not mind stepping back, letting Daniel take the lead. She had achieved everything she wanted professionally, and now she was content to focus on the other aspects of her life. In 1910, Xavier sold part of the ranch to Thomas, who had proven himself more than capable of running the operation. Xavier and Josephine kept the original house and enough land to run a small herd, enough to keep Xavier busy without exhausting him. They were in their 50s now, still healthy but aware that they were entering the later chapters of their lives. They spent their days working at a gentler pace, taking rides together through the valley, visiting their children and growing collection of grandchildren. Josephine still photographed occasionally, but now it was purely for pleasure, capturing images that interested her without worrying about commissions or deadlines. One autumn day in 1915, they rode out to the cliff dwellings where Xavier had proposed 36 years earlier. The ruins looked much the same, ancient and enduring, a reminder that some things lasted beyond any individual lifetime. They sat on the same ledge where they had sat so long ago, looking out over the Verde Valley. We have had a good life, Xavier said. Better than I ever imagined possible when I was a kid working cattle drives in Texas. The best life, Josephine agreed. We built something real, Xavier, something that will last long after we are gone. Thomas and Sarah will keep the ranch going. Clara is saving lives in Phoenix. Daniel is preserving memories for future generations. We did all right, Josie. We did better than all right. Josephine took his hand, lacing their fingers together. We loved each other well. That is the greatest accomplishment of all. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the shadows lengthen across the valley as the sun began its descent. This was where their forever had truly begun, where Xavier had asked her to build a life with him, and she had said yes, despite all her fears. It seemed fitting to come back here now, to remember that moment and honor it by living fully in this one. The years continued their inexorable march. In 1920, they celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary with a gathering of family and friends that filled the house and spilled out into the yard just as Xavier's birthday party had done 2 decades earlier. 3 generations were present now, from Thomas and Sarah's oldest grandchild, a girl of 15, to their youngest, a boy of 3. Clara had come from Phoenix with her husband, a fellow doctor she had met during her training. Daniel was there with his wife and their 4 children, all of them showing promise in various artistic pursuits. Josephine looked around at all these people, all these lives that she and Xavier had set in motion, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. She thought about that frightened girl who had stepped off the stagecoach in 1879, determined to prove she could succeed on her own. That girl had succeeded beyond her wildest dreams, but not by remaining alone. She had succeeded by opening her heart, by taking a chance on love, by building a life with a green-eyed cowboy who had seen her for who she truly was and loved her all the more for it. Speech. Someone called and the crowd took up the cry. Speech! Speech! Xavier stood, pulling Josephine up beside him. He cleared his throat, suddenly looking uncertain, and Josephine squeezed his hand encouragingly. "I am not much for speeches," Xavier began, "but I reckon I can say a few words about my wife, the woman who changed my life 40 years ago." When Josie got off that stagecoach, I took one look at her and knew my bachelor days were numbered. She was beautiful and fierce and talented, and she put up with my foolishness and my terrible attempts at dancing, and she gave me a family and a home and more happiness than any man deserves. His voice grew husky with emotion. "I love you, Josephine Jamison. I have loved you every day for 40 years, and I will love you until my last breath." Josephine felt tears streaming down her face, not caring who saw. "I love you too, Xavier. You made sure I was in your forever, and I am grateful for every moment of it." They kissed while their family cheered, and Josephine thought about all the kisses they had shared over 4 decades. The first tentative kiss on that cliff ledge, the passionate kisses of newlyweds, the tired kisses after long days of work, the comforting kisses during hard times, the joyful kisses when their children were born. Every kiss was different, but all of them were expressions of the same enduring love. As the celebration continued, Josephine found herself in the darkroom Daniel had built for her in town, looking through old photographs. Images of Xavier young and strong, of their children as babies, of the ranch in its early years. Each photograph was a moment frozen in time, a memory preserved against the erosion of years. But what struck her now was not what the photographs showed, but what they did not show. The photographs could not capture the feel of Xavier's arms around her, the sound of his laugh, the way her heart still skipped a beat when he walked into a room. They could not preserve the small daily kindnesses, the shared jokes, the comfortable silences of a long marriage. Photography had been her life's work, but Xavier was her life's love. The two had intertwined over the years, each enriching the other, but if she had to choose between them, she would choose Xavier without hesitation. Not because her work was not important, but because he had taught her that love did not diminish her independence or her achievements. It enhanced them, gave them meaning beyond mere accomplishment. She was still in the darkroom, lost in thought and memory when Xavier found her. "There you are. I wondered where you had gone. Just thinking about everything we have been through together. All the moments I captured with my camera and all the moments that were too precious or too fleeting to photograph." Josephine gestured to the images spread out on the work table. "A lifetime in silver and glass. It has been a good lifetime." Xavier came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "And we still have time left, you and I. More moments to capture, more memories to make. How much time do you think we have?" It was a question they had both been avoiding, but now it seemed important to ask. "Who knows? 10 years, 20 if we are lucky. However long it is, I want to spend every minute of it with you." Xavier turned her to face him. "You were always worried about being in someone else's forever, Josie. But the truth is, I am in your forever too. Whatever happens, wherever we go from here, I am yours and you are mine." "Always," Josephine agreed and kissed him with all the love and gratitude and joy that filled her heart. They did have more time, as it turned out. Years that they spent traveling together through Arizona, revisiting all the places that had been important to them. Years spent with their growing family, teaching grandchildren to ride and photograph and appreciate the beauty of the land. Years spent simply being together, content in each other's company. In 1928, when Josephine was 70 and Xavier was 74, they sat on the porch of the ranch house watching another sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and crimson. Xavier's health had been declining, his heart not as strong as it once was, and they both knew their time was growing short. But there was no sadness in the moment, only a sense of completion, of a life well lived. "You remember the first time I brought you here?" Xavier asked, his hand finding hers as easily as it always had. "You said you wanted to photograph the view, and I asked you to photograph me instead. I remember. I knew even then that I wanted to keep you, though I would not admit it to myself." Josephine squeezed his hand gently. "That photograph is still one of my favorites. You looked so hopeful, so determined to make something of yourself out here." "I did make something. We made something together." Xavier's voice was soft but certain. "A family, a home, a life worth living. And it was all because you said yes when I asked you to stay." "I would say yes again, every time," Josephine said. "In every lifetime, in every version of this story, I would choose you, Xavier Jamison." They sat in silence as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, the sky fading from gold to purple to deep blue. Stars began to appear, the same stars they had watched for nearly 50 years of marriage. Somewhere an owl hooted, and the night wind carried the scent of sage and pine. It was the smell of home, of belonging, of a life fully lived. Xavier passed away peacefully in his sleep that night, with Josephine beside him holding his hand. She woke at dawn to find him gone, his face peaceful, a slight smile on his lips as though he had left this world with no regrets. She wept then, deep racking sobs that shook her whole body, mourning the loss of her love, her partner, her best friend. But even in her grief, Josephine felt grateful. Grateful for every moment they had shared, every memory they had made, every challenge they had overcome together. Xavier had given her 49 years of love, had supported her dreams while building his own, had shown her that independence and partnership could coexist, that she could be fully herself while being fully his. She arranged a simple funeral, knowing Xavier would have hated anything elaborate. He was buried in the family plot on the ranch, overlooking the valley he had loved. All their children and grandchildren came, and many of the people from Camp Verde whose lives Xavier and Josephine had touched over the decades. They told stories about Xavier, about his kindness and his humor, about the way he had always been willing to help a neighbor in need. After the funeral, Josephine sat in the house alone for the first time in 49 years. It felt strange and wrong, this solitude she had once craved. But as she looked around at the life they had built together, at the photographs covering the walls and the furniture they had chosen and the home they had made, she felt Xavier's presence still. He was in every corner of this place, every memory, every moment preserved in silver and glass. She lived for another 6 years, long enough to see Arizona celebrate its 25th year of statehood, long enough to hold her first great-great-grandchild. She continued to photograph occasionally, though her hands were not as steady as they once had been. Mostly she spent her time with family, telling stories about Xavier, about the early days of the ranch, about what life had been like when Arizona was still a territory and the West was still wild. In the spring of 1934, Josephine became ill with pneumonia. Clara came from Phoenix to care for her, but they both knew it was only a matter of time. Josephine was 76 years old, and she was tired, ready to rest after a long and full life. On her last day, she asked Thomas to bring her the leather-bound album Xavier had made for her all those years ago. She paged through it slowly, looking at each photograph, reading Xavier's captions, remembering. There they were, young and strong and full of hope. There were their children, growing and changing with each turning page. There was their life captured moment by moment, a testament to love that had endured. "He made sure I was in his forever," Josephine whispered to Thomas, who sat beside her holding her hand. "And I made sure he was in mine." "You will be together again soon, Mama," Thomas said, his voice thick with tears. "He is waiting for you, I know." Josephine smiled, her eyes drifting closed. "I can feel him here already, can hear him calling me home." She passed away peacefully that evening, with all her children gathered around her. And though they mourned, there was also celebration, for Josephine had lived exactly the life she wanted, had loved deeply and been deeply loved in return. She had captured countless moments for others, but her greatest achievement was the life she had lived, the love she had shared, the family she had raised. They buried her beside Xavier in the family plot, and on her headstone they carved words from one of Xavier's captions in the album. "She captured moments, but she gave me forever." The ranch continued for generations after, passed down through the family Xavier and Josephine had created. Their great-great-grandchildren still work the land, still look out over the Verde Valley and see the beauty their ancestors saw. And in the house Xavier built and Josephine made into a home, the photographs still hang on the walls. Images of a young cowboy and a determined photographer who found each other in the wild Arizona territory and built a love that lasted beyond death, beyond time, captured forever in silver and glass, and in the stories passed down through the generations. The legacy of Xavier and Josephine Jamison lived on not just in the land and the family, but in the example they set. They showed that love and independence need not be opposites, that two strong people could build something stronger together than either could alone. They proved that taking a chance on love was worth the risk, that opening your heart could lead to joy beyond measure. And somewhere in the universe, beyond the reach of cameras and time, Xavier and Josephine are together still, building there forever, moment by precious moment, for all eternity.